The purpose of exposure therapy is not to prove that we're safe, since certainty is not possible by OCD's standards or otherwise. Rather, we're trying to learn that it's possible to be safe even in the unknown. Exposure and response prevention. The behavioral treatment approach to mastering OCD is called exposure and response prevention, ERP. ERP involves systematic, repeated, and prolonged exposure to situations that provoke obsessional fear, along with abstinence from compulsive behaviors. In short, you purposely get in front of your fears, either in literal physical terms, for example, touching something that upsets you, or in theoretical terms, for example, imagining a feared situation, and you practice resisting the compulsive response. ERP demonstrates for your mind what it needs to better process the false information about the things you fear. If you want to stop obsessing about something, you have to stop responding to thoughts and feelings about that thing as if they were important. To do that takes practice. You have to expose yourself to the things, ideas, and/or feelings you fear, and you have to prevent yourself from the response, which would be the compulsion to neutralize, suppress, or otherwise undo whatever your brain presents to you. Habituation. When we choose to change our behavioral reaction to an unwanted thought, we may at first feel very uncomfortable. But eventually, our minds adapt to this new pairing through a process called habituation. By stopping our compulsive and avoidant behaviors, we stop the negative reinforcement and learn over time that we can tolerate the presence of our unwanted thoughts. The end result is that thoughts that were once a trigger are no longer so triggering. Essentially, by repeatedly encouraging our fears without compulsions, the brain tires of sounding the alarm of fear, anxiety, or disgust just to have us ignore it. So the alarm gets quieter and quieter with continued practice. So being unimpressed by your triggers becomes the new habit. As you witness this change in your brain, you learn that without compulsions, your distress goes away simply with time. Psychotherapeutic approaches to OCD have traditionally focused on habituation as the only goal of treatment. Naturally, we want to see our fears subside when we put in the hard work of gradually exposing to them, and it's extremely rewarding when they do. The model is simple. Start with something a little scary and overcome it. Move on to something scarier and overcome it, and so on. But there are two problems with relying on this approach exclusively. First, fears, being a natural part of the human condition, often fail to go away completely and often come back like the embers of a campfire that haven't been extinguished. You may have noticed your own OCD-related fears subside and return many times. Second, and perhaps more importantly, a focus on getting fear, anxiety, disgust, and other forms of distress to go away plays into OCD's claim that we shouldn't have these feelings, and that the goal should be to flee from them when they arise. To be mindful involves having the capacity to make space for distressing experiences, neither running from them nor letting them get between us and the things we value. So while it's good to see habituation occur, that is, it's useful to feel less distress in the presence of the same trigger, learning to stand still in the presence of distress and make non-compulsive choices is another important way to understand ERP. Learning that it's safe to not know. We evolved to be threat detectors. Perhaps the most difficult hurdle to overcome in an effort to be mindful is the fact that we did not evolve to enjoy the present moment. Savoring your food gets you eaten by hyenas. So we quickly learn what is dangerous, and we slowly learn what is safe. The purpose of exposure therapy is not to prove that we're safe, since certainty is not possible by OCD's standards or otherwise. Rather, we're trying to learn that it's possible to be safe, even in the unknown. When you get triggered, your OCD takes you to a place you may have come to call intolerable fear. Whenever you find yourself in that place, you do whatever compulsions you can to get out of it. But if we go to that place on purpose, exposure, rather than show up there totally unprepared as if in a nightmare and intentionally resist compulsions, response prevention, we start to form associations with the trigger other than intolerable fear. We learn that the feared object does not necessarily predict a bad or harmful outcome. In other words, by interacting with it differently, we learn that escape isn't necessary, and we form less threatening associations with it. These associations essentially get in the way of, or inhibit you from, thinking you can't handle the trigger. This concept, called inhibitory learning, and pioneered by the research of Michelle Krask and colleagues, essentially frames ERP as taking the trigger-danger response pairing that your OCD capitalizes on and switches it to a trigger-new response pairing. The better we can remember this new pairing, the easier it is to remain mindful when triggered and to resist compulsions. So, what are the most effective ways to create this kind of learning and recall it? Jonathan Abramowitz highlights 5 key elements in the inhibitory learning approach to exposure and response prevention: anxiety tolerance, disconfirming expectations, surprise, combining fear cues, and variety. Remember it with the mnemonic, always do something courageous and vulnerable. A. Always. Anxiety tolerance. A good ERP session involves confronting your fear and emphasizes staying with the distress, anxiety, disgust, or whatever else comes up. In a purely habituation model, we would wait for your anxiety to go mostly or completely down after each exposure, but actually, all we need to do is stay with the discomfort and observe it mindfully. If it goes down, great. If it doesn't, we can actually move to the next task with the anxiety and learn an even better lesson. That anxiety doesn't have to freeze you. You may have already noticed this. When you do something that scares you and try to be cool about it, you don't get the same long-lasting benefits as when you do something that scares you and just let yourself feel what that feels like. D. Do. Disconfirm expectations. If we expect something to be dangerous, we tend to avoid it. If we don't avoid it and experience something other than danger, this expectation is disconfirmed. If we go into a triggering situation, an exposure, with the expectation that something bad will happen unless we do compulsions, then resist those compulsions and discover that nothing bad or intolerable happened, we have violated this expectation. In other words, we learned something, and this new learning gets in the way of the old OCD learning. Research shows that the bigger the mismatch between expectations and experience, the more successful the treatment outcome. So, what happens when there's a big mismatch? S. Something. Surprise. Learning that something you had once assumed to be intolerable is now tolerable is quite a surprise. If you construct your exposures to heighten the likelihood that this will in fact be surprising, you get more bang for the buck. This is why it's important not to let the cognitive therapy skills you learned in the previous chapter convince you the fear won't come true before doing exposure to it. We want to be surprised when we find out we can handle our exposures. Further, when anxiety spikes unexpectedly and we still stick to the game plan, we learn we're capable of coping better than we assumed. This concept even extends to the idea that when our fears are occasionally confirmed, this still helps us to overcome them. For example, perhaps you have contamination OCD, and you do get sick after doing many germ-focused exposures with less hand-washing, or perhaps you fear harming yourself impulsively, and you see an article about someone who harmed themselves without explanation, making you think these things really can happen. These types of experiences increase your fears unexpectedly. But if you continue to do ERP anyway, you learn that these unwanted outcomes happen very rarely and that you can cope with them, which further strengthens the learning you're trying to achieve. C. Courageous. Combining fear cues. To be mindful is to be aware, and to be aware is to know what you're doing when you're doing it. How do you know you're afraid? Your brain uses cues to recognize that you're being exposed to something that could be scary. One fear cue may be an actual object, such as the door to a public restroom that may be triggering to touch when you have contamination fears. But another cue may be the scary stories in your head, such as, people with dirty hands may have touched this door before me, and now their germs may be on my hands. Yet another cue is the physical sensation of fear, such as shortness of breath or increased heart rate. ERP has its biggest impact when you combine more than one of these types of cues, so you have the opportunity to learn that you can be with the whole experience and tolerate it. V, and vulnerable, variety. We don't want to learn only that we can touch one doorknob on one door or have one specific thought in one situation without falling apart. Rather, we want to generalize and learn that we're free to have any experience we choose and navigate any thought or feeling that may arise. The way to make ERP the most likely to generalize is variety. So, whatever exposures are in your plan, seek out ways to change the context and style of the exposure. You can try exposures in different places, for example, many different doors and handles in many different buildings. Also, you can utilize different exposure styles, which we'll describe next. Now that you have an idea of why ERP works and how to make it most effective, let's go over different ways to design and implement your exposures. In vivo exposure. In vivo exposure means confronting the things you fear in real life by trying to make direct contact with them. In simple terms, what you're trying to accomplish by doing ERP is to get some time in the ring with your fears instead of constantly running. Your mind has learned that obsessions must be followed by compulsions. It has carefully calculated this based on your observed behavior. If you can demonstrate to your mind that you're capable of being in front of your fears without doing compulsions, then your mind has to admit that compulsions are a choice. If that's true, it must mean that the obsessions are not as automatically important as previously assumed. If that's true, then they may not be worth any response, let alone a compulsive one. You may have seen media portrayals of ERP in which people were forced to do disgusting, dangerous, and ridiculous things all at once. This is not ERP. While exposure definitely pushes your limits, it's not about learning to swim by being shoved into the deep end of the pool while your therapist yells, "Swim!" We're building brain muscles here. If we were building body muscles, we wouldn't start with a 200-pound barbell. You'd put your back out and stop coming to the gym. We also don't waste time with empty gestures in ERP. You may lift a 2-pound dumbbell at the gym, but don't delude yourself into thinking that this will give you bulging biceps. You want to start with something challenging but achievable, and you want to do this thing until it's no longer too challenging, and then you raise the weights. Once you begin to build strength, you can start playing around with different exercises at different degrees of difficulty. To stick with the metaphor a little longer, keep in mind that doing only bicep curls with ever-increasing weight only strengthens one part of the arm. The variety of arm-related exercises covering different parts of muscles are what give you maximal arm strength.